one day we went over there and he had a toolbox. And I said, what kind of tools do you have in it? It was like a little kid's toolbox. Well, he opened it up and it was a Playboy magazine. And that was my first introduction to pornography. And one of the requirements for us to be a member of this fort or this boys club was to show our penis. Okay? Now, as I unpacked that went from that to basically a full molestation. And for years, I never looked at that. In fact, I denied it because this wasn't the dirty old man down the street that I was talked about, or when you spend the night at your friend's house, be careful, all those kind of things we tell our kids, right? But this is one of my best buddies.
But that awareness of what I should be doing and what I should not be doing, and yet the reality of what I am doing and not doing, there was always this kind of miserable internal sense of constant failure, constantly being displeasing to God, just not measuring up, being uniquely flawed, which of course is the essence of what shame feels like, right?
This does horrific emotional abuse to your wife. And I really believe, Gary, this contributed to her early death. I really do. And tears, I share that. So, and I hope your audience catches the severity of that. Oftentimes we talk about the man, right? But it's the wives too that we need to minister to.
Yes, how we can become so kind of miserable in our own existence or miserable within ourselves that we split off from ourselves, that we begin to live this fantasy life as much as escape as much as we possibly can out of our own existence into something else.
So even in my brokenness, and I want your audience to see this, God is at work. God is at work in these. When you look back and you reflect, and God starts to heal that shame, you see him working in that brokenness. He never leaves. He's always there.
Well, hello there, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. Whether you're coming to us through Love and Truth Network or through a connection to Transforming Congregations, we're just glad that you're here and glad that you're joining us again for another episode. And of course, want to invite you into future episodes as well. But today, I'm excited to have my friend and ministry partner, Mike Manzie, here with us to share some of his own story and just for us to be able to engage with each other. Mike and I have known each other for a while now. We've been engaged in a couple of different opportunities to share together and to just share our stories and be an encouragement to the body of Christ and to those who are struggling with a variety of different issues, sexual issues, struggles. And so I'm really happy to have Mike here. It's the first time he's joined us for our podcast, and he is leading a very important ministry in California. The name of that is New Creation or New Creations rather. And I've been very familiar with his predecessor, Russell Willingham, who's still involved in the ministry. Mike can unpack more of that for you, but I just remember years and years ago, going to my first couple of Exodus conferences back in probably 1999 and 2000, 2001, and meeting Russell Willingham there, meeting him. He often taught there and shared, did workshops. And I happened to have a couple of conversations with Russell standing in the lunch line or whatever. And he was just always a huge encouragement to me. And I was just in the very kind of beginning stages of trying to wrap my brain around what I was experiencing in terms of same-sex attraction and kind of coming out of that space and out of that identity to follow Jesus. And what does that all look like? And how do I navigate this? How do I handle these temptations? And I just appreciated Russell. He's one of those guys, as I look back on, who had a very formative impact on me through his teaching, through his books. Mike will talk more about that. But now Mike has shifted into the role of executive director over at New Creations. And we're just thrilled to have him here for this podcast. So Mike, without further ado and all my babbling, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary. It's an honor and privilege to be here.
That's great. Well, listen, our audience is used to just hearing the story of those that join us, our guests, and hearing how God has met them, what they wrestled with. And so we would just love for you to kind of unpack your story for us a little bit. And then beyond that, we'll just have some Q&A and some discussion around cultural topics and issues and things that may be on your heart that you'd like to share as well. But we'd love to hear your story first.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, thank you, Gary. Well, I'm currently in California, in Fresno, California, which is about halfway between Los Angeles and Sacramento, and we're actually San Francisco area there, and been here for about 50 years. Originally born and raised outside of Chicago, Illinois. My dad worked for the railroad over there, Santa Fe, and I was raised about 15 miles out of Chicago in a suburb. And I was there till I was 9 years old, and then my father got transferred. He had about 7 years left on the railroad. He was tired of the cold weather, so we came out to California. As I reflect back on my life and my testimony, I truly was blessed growing up. As I often recite, we were Christians when Christians weren't cool. I grew up in a Lutheran church, very Catholicism and all that kind of stuff. And my earliest years, the most thing I remember about the church is the jelly donuts. I remember those, right? But, I remember the liturgy. I didn't know what that was then. But what was interesting about that, my dad grew up in the Lutheran church. My mom grew up in the Catholic church. But my mom really knew the love of Jesus and the intimacy piece. And despite, as I'm going to share some of the struggles that I've had growing up, that was foundational to me. I always remember that as a little boy coming into my room, just encouraging me. I was born with a lot of skin allergies, which I still have today. My dad was in World War II, and he was in Nagasaki 10 days after the blast. And he had radiation poisoning, and that had carried over to me. They almost lost me several times as a little boy. So I had a lot of skin diseases growing up. My hands, now I'm 61 years old. They're wrinkled as a 61-year-old man, but they were like this way as a young baby and a boy. So I grew up with a lot of self-esteem issues. I was very small for my age. I was the smallest one in my elementary, junior high, and high school for the most part. Struggled with that. I had a cross-eyed. So in third grade, my teacher told me I'd always be behind and I'd never be good in math. So again, despite, that, and my mom knew that, she always encouraged me. I had a really close relationship emotionally with my mom, but not so much my dad. My dad was, like they say, came out of, I guess, the great, generation, right? World War II, very stringent, rule-minded. He was in the military, but then he worked for the railroad. But I loved my dad. He told me he loved me, but there was really no emotional connection with him for that. Anyhow, so we moved to California, and we didn't know a soul. Okay, we moved to basically Fresno, California, where we're at now. We had some relatives up north and down south, but literally knew nobody. Now in Chicago, my whole family was there, aunts and uncles and cousins. I mean, Christmas, we had 20, 30 people. Here we had nobody. My sister was here, but she had moved. My sister's 14 years older. And I never realized the impact of that, but I did years later as I started to go to counseling for my recovery. And I remember just an immense loneliness coming to California. I remember my mom not being my mom. And I'll give you a prime example of that. My dad worked midnights, and at that time, this was 1973, you didn't get 2 days off a week. You're lucky if you got him off a month. So he was gone, 12, sometimes 20 hours a day. So he'd leave early afternoon, and sometimes we wouldn't see him till the next day. Okay. And how I dealt with that, okay, I had some neighborhood friends, and I'll share more about that. But I remember as a young boy coming home, and I would say for the most part, 95% of the time when I knocked on the door to come home from school, my mom greeted me, as my mom would. How was your day? I prayed for you. She gave me a hug, all these kind of things. But on occasion, I knock on the door, and mom didn't come to the door. And as I share this story with your audience, I could still feel the trauma rise up in me because I knew something was wrong. I knock, and mom wouldn't come to the door. Well, I would use my key, and I'd walk in, and the kitchen was to the left, and mom always sat at the table. And I looked to the left, and she'd be slumped down. And I'd call my dad, and it would be the same routine on occasion. He'd yell at my mom, and then he'd come home from work. Well, they'd take me to my room, and mom couldn't walk. I had no idea. Again, I'm 9 years old. I have no idea what's going on. And I would see my dad put my mom to bed. Sometimes my dad would stay there. Other times my sister She moved away later on, but she was in town and she'd come and watch me. But I always loved next morning because mom was back to normal. Okay. Now, dad and the family said, well, mom was nervous at times. Well, she was drunk. She had become an alcoholic, and that's how she dealt with her depression and loneliness. Even though we were involved in the local Lutheran church, she was still very, very lonely. My mom came from a family, both her parents died in a horrific car accident. And this was in the 30s. And so she was pushed off to foster and some abusive family members that really took advantage. We don't even know, me and my sister know the extent of that, but there was a lot of catastrophic trauma that happened in there. So coming home from school, sometimes I'd have a great experience. Other times this would happen. And I will relate this story to you because I think it's imperative. I was sitting at my desk where I'm at now several years ago, and it was Good Friday. And all of a sudden, this trauma raised up in me, Gary, and I had no idea what it was. And all of a sudden, as I normally do, thank you, Lord, I just cried out to the Lord. I said, what is going on here? And he said, it's Friday. It's Good Friday. And he took me back 50 years before, because it was, as I call, Easter break. Now everybody calls it spring break, but I still call it Easter break, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember I was so excited because my dad was supposed to have that week off, but at the last minute he had to work. And I'm like, okay, so I'm going to be here all week with my mom. Okay, what kind of mom am I going to get, right? Well, my neighborhood buddy down the street told me that, hey, let's build a fort. That was great. Well, every time I came home in the early afternoon, around 2, 3 o'clock, okay, mom was fine, except on Friday. I walked in the door, and there she was again, and the trauma came up and rised into me. So again, I still at times, have to deal with that, but by the grace of God, not like I used to for that. With that said as well, how did I deal with that? Well, I went next door. I had a best friend, and his parents had recently got divorced, and one day we went over there and he had a toolbox, and I said, what kind of tools do you have in it? It was like a little kid's toolbox. Well, he opened it up and it was a Playboy magazine. And that was my first introduction to pornography. And to this day, Gary, and to this day, I can tell you, the viewers, that photo and her biography has been imprinted in my mind. I could tell you her name, I could tell you her measurements, and I could tell you that on vacation someday she wants to go to Africa. Okay. But the addiction, your viewers for the most part know that just overwhelmed me. And I just
And how old were you then, Mike?
I was 9 years old.
Okay.
I was 9 years old. Well, anyhow, my buddy's parents or dad at the time caught him with the magazine and said, okay, I remember him saying, if you look at dirty magazines, these are dads, you'll be grounded for life, something like that. But of course, we knew where they were and we would steal them. Okay. And then I don't remember all the details, but I remember him at one point, and again, my memory's version, but there was a fort we had built. And one of the requirements for us to be a member of this fort or this boys club was to show our penis. Okay. Now, as I unpack that went from that to basically a full molestation. And for years, I never looked at that. In fact, I denied it because this wasn't the dirty old man down the street that I was talked about, or when you spend the night at your friend's house, be careful, all those kind of things we tell our kids, right? But this is one of my best buddies, And sadly, I remember telling my mom what happened, that he touched me. Now, I'm going to say this, and some of your viewers will probably be shocked, but my mom told me, tell him not to do that. Okay. And it's not because she didn't care. She loved me immensely, but she didn't know how to respond to this. Yeah. And I wouldn't tell my dad. Okay. I just never would tell my dad those kind of things. I never had that type of relationship with him. And that went on for many years. And that was my relief. His dad was gone a lot. because his wife had left him. So he picked up a second job. And I remember him having centerfolds in his closet. His dad didn't care, you know. And I remember sneaking into his house when they were gone and looking at the magazines.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at one point, I want to be careful with your growers, but the first time I ejaculated was during one of those assaults, and I had no idea what happened. I thought I had urinated,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember about during that time, the time frame is a little foggy, but I remember my dad talking to me about the birds and the bees, but it was about a 20-second talk.
Right.
And that was about it. And then he mentioned something. I don't even want to mention it to your viewers.
Yep.
But it stuck in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It was something very sexual that men and women do. And I just went, oh, and years later, I never had enough, confidence to ask him. I remember one time I was in the garage masturbating, and he caught me and he shamed me. And as I always tell the people I counsel with, he should have brought me on my lap and said, okay, son, you're of age. Let's have that talk. Another time I remember talking to somebody in a store and asking questions. And I remember my dad said, why are you talking to this lady so much? And I said, I wonder if she's a virgin. My dad said, do you even know what that word means? I said, yeah, it means you date. That doesn't mean that. Don't say,
right.
We don't talk that way. So again, that typical type of a deal for that. And but again, when my dad was home on a couple days a month, we enjoyed our time together. I loved my dad. But when I have clients and when I talk about abandonment, one of the things that Russell taught me, trauma oftentimes is not what happened to you, it's what should have happened to you. And I know your wife has, I just love your wife, and I've been privileged to sit in a lot of her talks and talk about that attunement and that engagement, very young. And I can remember looking back over my life of going, okay, I remember certain times on vacation, I was just really terrified because my dad wasn't there. My dad would go fishing or would go out with relatives. I was by myself. So I could, God used that time, as horrific as it was, to help me now, minister to others. I want to add a little bit more to that. So as the molestation continued into my teens, obviously I enjoyed it. And that was a big struggle for me. Immediately I thought I was gay. Okay. Although I still had the desire for girls, right? But I was so shy, I never asked any of them out, right? And occasionally looked at a boy differently. I was okay in athletics, but I wasn't good enough to make any of the sports teams. And I remember one day I was in 8th grade and I was watching the school baseball team play. And these were my heroes, Gary. Okay, these were the kids that were tall. They were, good baseball players, all that kind of stuff. And I remember just idolizing them. And as they came off the field, I remember, if with baseball, they have those metal cleats. And they were walking, and I could still hear the cleats, right? And I was looking at him, and one of them, the star, player on the team, wound up becoming a professional ball player years later. But I remember he looked at me and said, "Look at that faggot."
Mm.
And just then, that confirmed who I thought I was at that point. Words matter.
Yes.
And my actions, obviously, yeah, okay. And that really set my ID. That's who I thought I was, despite going through confirmation, right? Knowing I went through that with the Lutheran Church. But here's that little boy that suffered with a lot of self-esteem issues, and just a myriad of other things, through that. And that was confusing for me for decades. And one of the things I used to do is I would beat up my abuser. I'll call him my abuser now. And I thought, why would I beat him up? And as I went through counseling, Russell was one of my key counselors in my recovery. He said, your penis doesn't know who's touching it. Your abuser, your wife, your girlfriend, yourself, and that just put me in just this dilemma. Not now, it's freed me from that, obviously. But during that time, now I can really feel how God was there. But through all of this, I truly, from the spiritual aspect, God never left me. Even though I went through this, now decades later, God used that horrific event to heal me. But I will say it was so shameful for me. I never told anybody up till several years ago.
And when you talk about the shameful event, what event are you talking about?
Just allowing that boy to continually molest.
So the ongoing, yep. And so he was the one that was the perpetrator of that.
Right.
Usually.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I lost my mom when I was 21. And after that, I started to do a little cross-dressing. So it was like, okay, boy, what have I really become? Okay. And, dealing with, oh boy, if you love me, you obey me. Well, I guess I don't love you. I guess I won't obey you. Am I even saved? Right?
Yeah. When you say, when you love me, you'll obey me, or if you love me, you'll obey me, you're quoting Jesus from John 14, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Yep.
And going back to that shame, me and my first wife were married for 20 years, and the Lord called her home. I never even told my first wife. I told my wife now, Joy, only because we had a discussion about somebody that we knew that was molested. And at one point she said, I respect you as a counselor, but you don't know what it's like to be molested.
Mm.
And everything in me, I felt the Lord tell me, confess.
Yep.
But I didn't. I went to bed just very traumatized. Woke up the next morning, and I remember her saying, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, it goes back to our discussion last night. And she says, well, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, honey, but you don't understand what it's like. And I broke down, Gary. I fell down in a fetal position, and it all came pouring out. God freed me. God freed me. And I can get emotional now and just feel the Holy Spirit comfort me now. And I remember that day, that afternoon, I stayed home from work. And again, that afternoon, my pastor was moving, and he wanted me to bring over some boxes and my hand truck. And I went over to his house, and he's like, hey, Mike, great to see you. And I remember going, I've been molested. And I fell at his feet, and his wife came and grabbed me and prayed for me. And it just flowed out of me because again, that was something, that was my pride, but that was something. And I tell that to the audience, and I've been in counseling now for many years. God wants to free you at every single level. And I kept pushing it off. Oh, I'm an adult now. It wasn't the dirty old man, I'm healed. I played that image, and the Lord said, no, we're not going to play games anymore.
Right. And so, Mike, you've mentioned several times earlier in your childhood, and then even the conversation with your wife where she assumed you had no understanding of what it was like for someone to be molested, that kind of thing. And you mentioned the word trauma a few times as we're talking here. Can you just kind of, can you unpack that a little bit more? Like, what was it like for you as a kid? If you can go back to some of the things you've referenced, and you have to remember them exactly, but that feeling of trauma that you've mentioned, you can feel some of it, like even now, just kind of rise up, some of those familiar feelings.
Yeah.
What did that trauma feel like? And what were some of the things kind of around that you're talking about when you use that word?
The first word that comes to me, 2 words, is physically debilitating.
Okay.
Just debilitating. The anxiousness, the worry, not knowing who I am, and when I went through recovery and realized, and I knew Jesus died on the cross for me, right, for my sins, but I didn't realize what love and mercy was. Yeah, that's okay. You died on the cross for me, but look what I did. I'm different. I'm a pervert. I'm a faggot. Okay. I'm stupid. I'm in special needs. Right. And to me, what that did is it cast an image of you're not normal. Okay. Almost in any setting, for years, even as an adult. And then taking that and then going, well, wait a minute. You say you're a Christian? Okay. So that other side of it, constantly wondering, I think I can probably equate it to maybe an atheist or an agnostic who's wondering, okay, what's out there? Is there something more for that? But always, going back to that. And I remember, to your question, going back, after the Lord healed me from pornography, looking at videos and stuff like that. And remember, I started in the 70s, so they were the 8mm tapes. It wasn't the VHS. And my dad had a camera, so we used to watch these without sound. I'll talk more about that if you want. But as I grew to an adult and I realized this, that's what I used for stress, for relief. Okay. I looked at that. I thought of these images and that trauma came up. Even as I went back and I thought some of those childhood experiences of molestation, it was like, okay, I still remember the euphoric feeling at times, you know, but then again, I felt God. So I'm trying to explain it, but it was like a push and pull, but it was just an immense uneasiness for me, you
Well,
know.
and I think when you like when you mentioned the push and pull, I think that really describes a lot of my own experience growing up in a Christian home as well, and then early sexualization, et cetera. But that constant, that miserable feeling, and so tell me if this kind of aligns with what you're talking about, but that awareness of what I should be doing and what I should not be doing, and yet the reality of what I am doing and not doing that really doesn't align with the teaching that I'm hearing in church and those kinds of things. I'm reading the Bible. And so there was this always this kind of miserable internal sense of constant failure, constantly being displeasing to God, just not measuring up, being uniquely flawed, which of course is the essence of what shame feels
Right.
like, right? So
Right.
similar feelings to what you're describing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I this just came to mind. I think the Lord brought it to mind. I remember going over to one of my other buddies' houses, and his again his his brother wound up being a professional athlete, but he had all these trophies, and I was just enamored. I went, wow. And my friend, who wound up being a thief, said, "You want one of them?" And he gave me one of them. So I took it home and I put it on my shelf. My parents didn't say anything. My other buddies came over and said, "You didn't win that." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm collecting them for marble. I like the marble on the trophies."
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I used to look at them and think, oh, now I'm somebody. I have a trophy. So I started a fantasy.
Yeah.
I started a fantasy life where I would come home. And to your point about the trauma, yeah, it was debilitating. But then I got in my own fantasy world and I thought, wow, if I was big, if I did this, if I did that. Even the early video games, now they're all enamored. You can have, be those characters now. But that's who I was. And then later on, as God did that, I remember won an award as a musician, in junior high. And it was like, oh, and then later on, I started to do more of the X Games sports, motorcycles, motocross, won a lot, jet ski racing. I won a lot of trophies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was just another, and then in law enforcement, I had a lot of accommodations, life-saving, things like that. And I realized, okay, that's not going to make me happy. That doesn't give me worth. What the worth and affirmation has to come from Jesus and Jesus alone.
Well, and I want to step back for a moment. I love what you're sharing there, but I want to step back for a moment because also a very similar dynamic was at play in my life. And for those viewing or listening to this, they may be able to pick up on some of this, or maybe a loved one that they have in their life may have experienced this. But that the reality of how we can become so kind of miserable in our own existence or miserable within ourselves that we split off from ourselves, that we begin to live this fantasy life as much as escape as much as we possibly can out of our own existence into something else. Like, and when you're talking about, your friend giving you his brother's trophy and you taking that home, the idea that like seeing that and having that, on your shelf in your own mind and heart, I think part of what you're describing, and this was true for me too, is it's this kind of this appropriation of something that doesn't belong to us at all, but it's it's wanting so much to be someone worthy of a trophy or someone worthy of an award or somebody worthy to be noticed by this person who is great at sports and has, is very, likable and very popular and those kinds of things. And there's all kinds of ways that we can accumulate, and oftentimes do as kids, accumulate a myriad of things that we escape into, patterns of things to run to. And certainly when you combine that with pornography and masturbation, usually chronic masturbation, and all of those kinds of things, we can be swallowed up in a variety of different ways in a lot of we can outwardly live what looks like a fine Christian life or upstanding life, to many people around us, but inwardly, oh my goodness, there can be so much deep
Oh,
dysfunction,
absolutely.
so much self-hatred. And the more that we live in that cycle, the more we're constantly coming around to a place of just wanting to escape. And so we continue to live out the thing that we hate. And it just is a miserable downward spiral. And I think, again, you've described that really well. And then it transfers into, or can often transfer into, okay, no longer am I living off of what, in a fantasy life of what somebody else has done, like I've taken their trophy or whatever, or just in like fantasy sexual things, which of course is what pornography is all about, and fantasy in our own minds. But then to begin accomplishing some things, to actually be doing some things that we ourselves are accomplishing, and yet so much of it still feels false and fake because it's the good false self. It's the image we're trying to build up for everybody else to know and see and relate to. It's the image we build up to protect the really ugly parts of ourselves. That person is achieving these things, but sometimes it doesn't even feel like we're achieving it. Do you know what I mean?
Well, absolutely. And to that point, I bring up two stories. I my first season of basically a career was in law enforcement. And again, tied with sexual brokenness, I remember going to basically a strip club on a disturbance. And after we settled the disturbance, there was about probably 6, 8 of our officers, and we walked out, we settled the fight, whatever it was. And one of the officers comes out and says, "Hey, that dancer wants to give you her phone number." And when I got that phone number, Gary, I looked at my fellow colleagues who are a lot taller, stronger. Some guys were on SWAT. I didn't have time to be on SWAT yet. It was like, wow, what a boost in my ego. Okay, what a boost in my ego. Years later, I got selected to be trained for aircraft hostage rescue, okay, in San Francisco in case terrorists would come on the West Coast, okay? As manly as that was, working with other SWAT teams and doing that cool stuff, at night, what did I do? I acted out. Mm-hmm. But I was the only man small enough to crawl into the front landing gear of a 747. And at that moment, the Lord said, "That's why I made you a smaller statured man." So even in my brokenness, and I want your audience to see this, God is at work. God is at work in these. When you look back and you reflect, and God starts to heal that shame, you see him working in that brokenness. He never leaves. He's always there.
Right.
But as I go through and I unpack and I get healed, I go, "Oh, that's right. That was a kiss of God. That was favor." Okay, as I look back in my life. And I think of all the things I did, but also all the things I could have done. And God said, "See, I protected you from that because I loved you."
Yeah, it's so true. When did you actually I don't know if you have many people have a year and a month and a day that they know that they gave their lives to Christ. Others kind of grow into an awareness of what they need and surrender their lives, but they don't necessarily have a specific date for that. When did you come to a place of real surrender, do you feel, in your relationship with God? Was it when you were a kid, or was it when you were an adult?
Well, a couple times, rededication. So I was baptized as a baby, but I always knew the love of Christ, that intimacy level. Okay, so it wasn't like, I had an epiphany moment and, my salvation story. I rededicated to my life to Christ as a high school student. Okay. When I went through, I had 2 recoveries, one in 1995, and then when my first wife passed, I relapsed. And in 2008, I remember basically in February, that's when I was all in for Christ, 100%. Because at that point, it was like, okay. And I've been on that, as I describe it, a 90-mile-an-hour freight train for almost 20 years now of living for Christ and realizing, who he is in me.
Yeah. And so your first wife passes away. Of course, that's absolutely devastating. And you relapsed. What did that entail? What did that kind of look like a bit?
Well, what that was I was in law enforcement, had a very successful career, but my immediate boss was basically doing unrighteous things. He was very corrupt, and I brought it to my bosses. Initially, they ignored it. One of my immediate supervisors wound up resigning it because he said, "I'm out of here. I have enough time for retirement." I didn't. During that whole time, I basically, because of the panic attacks, I resigned. That's another long story, testimony, not get into that. But during that time, my first wife went to the hospital. Her name was Stacy, for pancreatitis. And 41 days later, she passed. And I knew part of it. The doctor told me, Mike, I don't know what to put on her on her certificate, death certificate. We've never seen this. But I had betrayed her not once, but twice in my sexual brokenness. Okay. So again, to the men out there who think, hey, this is just on me. No, this does horrific emotional abuse to your wife. And I really believe, Gary, this contributed to her early death. I really do. And tears, I share that. So, and I hope your audience catches the severity of that. Oftentimes we talk about the man, right? But it's the wives too that we need to minister to.
Yes.
But what had happened to that is it wasn't anything. I had called that childhood friend up who I had remained friends with decades later, and come on over, bring some of your porn movies, okay? And just act it out. Nothing, just masturbate and watched it. But I will share this to you. I had loaned my laptop to him, okay? At the end of that weekend. We didn't do anything together, okay? And again, another testimony. I had left law enforcement. I had worked for a training company, and it was a work laptop. And my fellow employees found out what was on that laptop, and they turned it into the Department of Justice Child Exploitation Unit. That's another testimony how God saved my life. But I got investigated for what was on that laptop.
That he was looking up.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I didn't put it on there. But what am I going to say? It's not mine. Right. And I remember God saying, you know what? I love you too much. I'm going to stop this now. I don't care if you've been sober for a few years, which I was. And this is important for your viewers to know. I thought I was healed. No, I wasn't. I was sober. There's a difference between being sobered and being healed. And I'll explain that. But that's where I felt God say, fine, you want to go down that road? You go down that road. You want to minister to other men? I was ministering. I had accountability groups, but I'd fall every couple of years. But you'll do that in federal prison.
Yep.
Okay. And that's when I said, you know what? I am done. And I remember going to my pastor during that time. And I said, what's going on? I lost my wife. My house had foreclosed because she was on the loan. Okay. I lost my house. I lost my job. I lost my health. Okay. I lost my mother when I was 21, but my father was dying. I almost lost everything. And I went to my pastor and I said, what is going on to me? My whole life is collapsing. And he said, Mike, he said, I'm resigning next month. And the selection committee wants a whole list of the new requirements for my predecessor. He goes, here's what I want. I want him broken. Financially, physically, spiritually, emotionally, but brought up in Christ. And that's what God is doing. He's getting you down to the core. And that is so true, brother Gary. And at that moment that happened in 2008, it was just like, oh my gosh. And right after that, and the Lord had told me, you live a life of righteousness, I will bring a new life. I will give you a new family. And he literally did. My first wife, we never had kids for 20 years. I met Joy. I went from no kids to stepfather to grandpa to grampy. And now I'm honey because my youngest granddaughter calls me honey because that's what my wife calls me.
That's so funny. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's just, God just completely restored it. And if I realized how much God wanted to bless me, and this isn't a prosperity message,
right?
But just bless me and give me joy and freedom and not guilt. If I would have taken my recovery sooner, decades earlier. But again, God redeems that time.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this week's podcast. Please join us next week for part 2 of this interview.